thank you for joining us today at the debate earlier and now for the interview. Let's start with the Russian military transformation, the reform process that the armed forces went over the last few years, and how this has impacted the military efficiency of the armed forces.
I think people in the West moved from one extreme to another. They underestimated the might of Russian armed forces before, and they are now overestimating it now. We should turn to experience of Russian military reform that took part from 2009 to 2012. The starting triggering moment was war against Georgia. And what is good about Russian leadership, they took right lessons from this war, understanding that Russian armed forces are very, very old-fashioned.
How was that visible in Georgia?
For very clear reasons. They tried to move so-called reserved forces to fight in Georgia, and suddenly they found few things. First of all, the half of army vehicles and tanks were lost on Russian territory. They simply could not reach Georgia because they were not ready. Second, the commanders, they found that some commanders spent all their life in skeleton unit. They cannot prepare operation, they can't command people, and they refused to command people. They had to look for, in all huge Russian armed forces, for commanders who can command. And it was a shock for leadership, and the reform started. All problems I mentioned a few minutes before came from so-called mobilization, mass mobilization concept. On this concept of defense, Russian armed forces were based more than 100 years. The idea was that in peacetime period, Russian armed forces are huge school of military training. Their main goal was not to fight, not prepare for war. Their main goal was to prepare reservists. That's why very few units in Russian armed forces were fully staffed, because in case of war, they had to wait the arrival of reservists. Serdyukov, our former defense minister, understood the problem, and he made radical cuts in Russian armed forces. Cuts not in numbers of troops, but in numbers of units. He rejected from all skeleton units. All units had to be fully staffed. As the result, and again, because he rejected the idea of mass mobilization, he fired something like more than 150,000 of officers, because the only work of these officers was to wait reservists when they can command battalions and regiments of these reservists. These officers were not ready to conduct normal battle. So, as the result, Russian armed forces, the number of units, I'll give you only one example, the number of units in ground forces was reduced in 11 times, from 1,187 to 182 only. So, but as the result, all these units were fully manned. And in Russian military understanding, in Russian military strategy, it means that they are battle ready. So you can give order and they begin to fulfill this order in terms of hours. It was, from Russian point of view, it was a fantastic result. Because, I'll give you only one example, in 1999, it took 3 full weeks when Chechens terrorists intruded Dagestan. It took 3 full weeks to begin deployment of Russian troops. So, Russian armed forces, as the result of Serdikov reform, received huge advantage, a rapid deployment.
And this was visible later in Crimea?
Yes, it was visible before Crimea on 26th of February 2014, when Putin ordered to conduct so-called snap inspection. Mm-hmm. And on the cover of this snap inspection, in terms of 1 day, 40,000 troops were deployed on Russian-Ukrainian border. Then another example, of course, it's Syria. In 1 day, 60 aircrafts with all support appeared on Syrian territory. A day before, Western intelligence said there is nothing there. There is nothing there. In 1 day, 60 aircrafts appeared with all support troops. So it's a huge advantage. Added with another advantage, quick decision making. Mr. Putin do not need to consult anybody to make this decision. And in Russian military culture, there is such a term, threatening period. The period when the contradiction between states became abnormal and during the conflict became clear, and in some moment one of the states or or alliances make a decision to begin the war. It's a classical term. We can see this so-called threatening period in relation between US and Northern Korea now, for example. But in case there is only one guy who makes a decision, this threatening period became very short or doesn't exist. And it means that other side cannot prepare for defense or...
It's taken by surprise.
Yes, sure.
What about Donbass? How is that connected to these reforms? And is it a hybrid warfare? How should we understand hybrid warfare defined by Russians?
Okay, Donbass showed the another side of this coin. Okay, Mr. Putin received in his disposal very efficient troops, but they were relatively small. Something like 100, a little bit more, 100 or a little bit more thousand men. I think they discussed the question, can they repeat Crimean scenario on Donbass soil? And answer was no. First, because Crimea is very geographically is very good for invasion. If you take over Crimea, you can easily cut it from other Ukraine. And you need a relatively small number of troops. But when they began to think about the same scenario in Donbass, they suddenly understood that they have to establish border in place it's never exist. It means that you turn from this covert operation to something very traditional, normal occupation, with you should cut not 2 roads, but thousands of roads. You have to establish checkpoints, you have to establish garrisons, and they understood that they simply have no enough troops. So they moved to the next decision, this kind of so-called proxy war. The war when Russian troops are deployed along the border and interfere only in crucial situations, such as Ilovaisk in 2014 or Debaltseve in 2015. All other operation is taken by so-called volunteers or mercenaries. So I think people in the West, when they speak about hybrid warfare, they mean particularly this thing.
Proxy warfare in this case.
Proxy warfare.
And because we talked about Crimea, and it's of a special interest to us in Romania, Crimea is by definition connected to the problem of the Black Sea. What does actually Russia want in the Black Sea?
Look, many people disagree with me, but in my reading, we are now in a situation of new Cold War. If to accept this perception, we have no Black Sea region now. We have southern flank of this confrontation. And as normal for such kind of confrontation, so-called military technical perceptions, military technical decision plays primary role in decision-making process. That's why Russia is militarizing Crimea on high level. Just few recent facts. It was made a decision to deploy some shore defense systems such as Bal and Bastion, to deploy Air Force regiment, and to deploy paratroops regiment. It's adding the existing military force. Some analysts speak that Russia is going to establish their full military corps. It means at least 2-3 brigades. So it's absolutely clear that with this perception, Black Sea became the region of confrontation, and Russia tried to use Crimea to establish as access denial region. The military, again, military technical point is absolutely clear. If you are thinking about possible conflict there, first thing you should do is prevent your adversary to move reserves to support these countries in Black Sea, particularly Bulgaria and Romania. And that's why you need to strengthen air defense and shore defense.
But to what extent there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of threats over the last years from the Kremlin because of Romania hosting the ballistic missile defense. How do you assess this as a threat on one side to Russia, and what do you think the implications are for a host nation such as Romania in terms of security threats?
Look, Kremlin and for many times Putin insists on theory that Americans can easily change interceptors missile defense interceptors by Tomahawk cruise missiles.
So from defensive to offensive.
Absolutely. And the logics of Kremlin is that it is a huge threat to southern region of Russia, especially for Sochi, which because of Mr. Putin's intentions became second capital of Russia. So if to take it as a reality, very few serious military experts agree with this theory. Nevertheless, somebody proposed it to Mr. Putin and he likes it. So we should conclude that in worst case scenario, I'm speaking absolutely theoretically, but if we speak about worst case scenario, of course, in this case, this base will be target for first strike.
And when we talk about the military buildup in Crimea, it has happened in a very sudden and very amplified way over the last few years, basically since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, so the last 3 years. Now, the military budget of Russia has been increasing drastically over the last few years, but the projections for the next few years are that it will stagnate or in real terms actually be reduced. Do you think that this will also be connected to a decrease in the military buildup in the future in Crimea? Do you think the Black Sea will remain a priority in terms of military buildup?
It's no doubt that this reduction of military budget will not influence seriously on capabilities of Black Sea Fleet and military build-up in Crimea, because my feeling is that mostly this reduction will play a role in defense procurement, not in military build-up. I think that the building of very strong Black Sea Fleet will continue. And I think that further militarization will continue. The concept is that, okay, we cannot be, for this period, we cannot build blue water ships, but we have caliber missiles which cover the range of 3,000 kilometers that will deploy in Black Sea, not very big ships such as corvettes and frigates, together with non-nuclear submarines, but all of them are ready to carry these caliber missiles.
And because you wrote over the last few years a lot about military exercises as being connected to operations. There was one military exercise last year conducted in Russia, Caucasus 2016, that was where Romania was one of the focuses. And this year there's a lot of talk about what will happen in the next few weeks with Zabat 2017. How do you assess that in terms of the Black Sea security environment?
I must say that there is one general thing that Russia train with its forces on any theater. It's rapid deployment of huge number of forces to build overwhelming force to solve any problem militarily. It happened during Caucasus 2016. It was even more visible during Center 2015. And it's a big question mark what will happen during Zapad 2017. for clear reason that Russia cannot overcome the limits of Vienna document. They cannot officially, Russia cannot conduct exercises with more than 13,000 troops. Some experts suppose that Russia will cover these exercises with so-called snap inspections, which, according Vienna documents, permits to concentrate up to 40,000 troops. And all complaints and fears appeared from this point. When you concentrate something like 50,000 troops, you receive the instrument for some kind of military action. And of course, everybody remember pretty well the example of snap inspections in 2014, which was the beginning of Ukrainian crisis.
So now that we see that the situation is pretty grim in the Black Sea, and there's a military buildup on both sides, there's threat perceptions, then there's also lots of fear on both sides. What do you think we should take into consideration as Romania, as part of the Black Sea security environment, but also as NATO members in order to deter the situation and to avoid a war?
Look, I agree that all scenarios we have are rather gloomy to be true. And if to accept again the idea that we are in a situation of Cold War, it's particularly the time to recall positive experience of Cold War. The name is peaceful coexistence. What we need start immediately, if not yesterday, the talks on military confidence building measures. We need, I think it will be rational to forget all complaints about lost cooperation. It will never come again. Invisible future, at least. But what we need to concentrate now, how to survive in this very, very difficult environment. That's why we should try to start some talks on confidence building measures. We need CFE2. I understand pretty well all political constraints. I understand that NATO countries do not want to show that they are ready to conduct business as usual with Russia. Nevertheless, the situation looks rather dangerous. And that's why I think it's very important to start these talks. For sure, I am not so naive to suppose that these talks will bring its fruits immediately, or even in terms of years. But let us remember again, recall the experience of previous Cold War. CFE treaty talks were conducted for 18 years. And what is important, sometimes such talks of such kind, they establish specific environment that are very, very important. Now, mutual trust between Russia and NATO is far from zero. And I cannot see the ways we can establish this trust again, if to speak the relationship between countries, between leaders. It's hardly possible. What we can do is to, because of these talks, to establish some kind of mutual respect between professionals.
And rules.
Yes. So, in some critical situation, one colonel can call another and say, Ivan, I need to tell you something. You should immediately report to your boss. I'm sure you will trust me. Please, I want to see you in 15 minutes at the bar next street. It can work in some kind of crucial situation. Until time we can reestablish this new security system in Europe, we need to have something very partial, very modest, but nevertheless we need some kind of small network, some kind of small environment that can save us from the worst developments.
Thank you very much for taking the time and for your analysis and also for your recommendations.
It's my pleasure.